Hello, chess fans. In today's video I will share 3 exciting games that feature the Blackburne-Kloosterboer Gambit. Game 1 starts with e4. d5. e takes d5. c6. d takes c6. Queen to c7. c takes b7. Bishop takes b7. My opponent brings their knight to f3. I respond by developing my knight to c6. My opponent positions their bishop to e2. I counter by placing my knight on f6, c3. Long castle. d4. e5. Short castle. We exchange pawns. I advance my knight to g4. h3. h5. My opponent develops the knight to c3. In this position, can you find the best move for black? I seize the pawn on d4 with my knight, prompting my opponent to capture it with their knight. I then move my queen to h2, delivering checkmate. Game 2 starts with e4. d5. e takes d5. c6. d takes c6. Queen to c7. c takes b7. Bishop takes b7. Knight to f3. Knight to c6. Bishop to e2. Knight to f6. My opponent brings their knight to c3. Long castle. d3. h5. Short castle. I advance my knight to g4. g3. h4. My opponent positions their bishop to f4. e5. My opponent moves the bishop back to e3. I capture the pawn on g3. My opponent recaptures on g3. I take the bishop on e3, forking the queen and rook. The queen moves to d2, and I capture the rook. My opponent then takes the knight. I develop my bishop to c5, delivering check. The king moves to g2. I advance my knight to d4. My opponent responds by moving their knight to e4. We exchange pieces. I capture the knight on f3. My opponent moves the bishop to a6, delivering check. I move my king to b8. My opponent slides the queen to c3. I shift my rook to h2, delivering check. My opponent captures my knight. I move my queen to b6. My opponent then retreats the bishop to d3. In this position, can you find forced checkmate? I slide my queen to f6, delivering check. The king moves to g4. I shift my queen to g6 for another check. The king then moves to f3. I place my queen on h5, delivering yet another check. My opponent blocks the check by advancing the pawn to g4. Finally, I move my queen to h3, delivering checkmate. Game 3 starts with e4. d5. E takes d5. c6. D takes c6. Queen to c7. C takes b7. Bishop takes b7. My opponent brings their knight to f3. I respond by developing my knight to c6. My opponent positions their bishop to b5. I counter by placing my knight on f6. My opponent advances the knight to e5. In this position, can you find the best move for black? I capture the knight on e5, delivering check. My opponent blocks the check with their queen. We exchange queens. I advance my knight to d4. My opponent responds by moving the bishop to d3. I capture the pawn on g2 with my bishop, putting pressure on their position. In response, my opponent shifts their rook to g1. I retreat my bishop to e4, leading to an exchange of bishops. The king moves to d1. I capture the pawn on f2 with my knight. My opponent then resigns. Thank you so much for watching. We really appreciate your support. Don't forget to subscribe and tap that notification bell so you can stay updated with all our latest content.